Gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Today we have a new guest by shockingly popular demand. People keep asking, when are you going to have her on? And so I am nothing if, as Anthony Quinn says in Lawrence of Arabia, I am nothing if not a river to my people. So with that, we have Jean Twenge. I want to make sure I got it right. Twenge, right?
It's twangy, like twangy guitar.
Twangy. Okay. Professor of psychology at San Diego State University and author of more than 180 scientific publications and a bunch of books. Her latest book is Generations, the real differences between Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, the best generation. I put that in there. Boomers and silence and what they mean for America's future. Professor Twenge, thank you for joining the Remnant.
Thanks for having me.
So, even though it's kind of, you got it all in the title, I'm still going to ask the standard question I always ask, which is, what's your book about?
So it's about all 6 living American generations and the real data on how they actually differ from each other as opposed to the myths and stereotypes and rumors. And at the core of the book is the argument that technological change creates cultural change and thus differences among generations. That's why it's so different to live now compared to 200 years ago, 100 years ago, or even 20 years ago, is the technology that we live with.
Full confession, I have written many thousands of words about how, particularly in my younger years, about how much I dislike most of the stuff about generations. And because I will stand by this. I think most of the stuff about generations is bad. But you're one of the one, and I'm sure because you actually know this stuff, you probably agree with me to some extent. But I have to say, your writing probably more than anybody else's has made me revisit some of my priors and refine my opposition. Because I agree with you entirely about the technology thing. And I guess my biggest problem with the generational stuff, I'm a Gen Xer. I came to Washington and fellow Gen Xers of mine tapped into this baby boomer nostalgia for the glories of youth, and the Gen Xers cynically manipulated it to basically become youth correspondents this and voices of their generation that. And that kind of stuff really did bother me because I don't think identity politics arguments map very well over chronological age, but cultural arguments do. So why don't we just sort of like start where we agree? I just want to put that in the context there, but why don't we start where we agree, which is on the sort of overriding importance of technology.
Yeah. Well, with generations, I think you and I and probably most people agree on the big stuff. It's usually the little stuff where, you can get into discussions. I mean, the big stuff is simply that cultures change over time and that has an effect on people. And, technology is right at the forefront of that. So, when I say technology, most people are thinking of things like computers and smartphones and social media. And those absolutely had a big impact, especially on Gen Z, those born about 1995 to 2012. Had an effect on all of us, but probably mostly on, in terms of adolescence on that group. But it's also about all kinds of technology, things like air conditioning and better medical care and labor-saving devices and faster transportation. That's why it's just so incredibly different to live now compared to previous eras.
Yeah, my old boss, Ben Wattenberg, used to make the point that if you go back and you look at there was a shocking spike in shotgun marriages right around the time automobiles became prevalent in the United States. And it's because kids could get further away from their parents and their communities and get jiggy. And 9 months later, they had issues to deal with. And this has always sort of been like one of my big points is that conservative intellectuals love to argue about ideas. Ideas have consequences, all these things. But automobiles did more to change culture than pretty much any ideas that escaped a lab in Germany, mutated in France, and then came over to our English departments, right? But you can argue with Nietzsche or Sartre. You can't really argue with the Buick. You can't argue with the birth control pill. These are facts that change the material circumstances of society in ways that we then post hoc ascribe intellectual ideas to as a way to sort of demonize them or engage with them. And it's kind of a mismatch.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have to think about how generations are traditionally understood. Like the traditional understanding is big events happen, things like wars and pandemics and recessions and economic depressions and so on. And that's why generations are the way that they are. And that has some truth to it, but it misses out on so many of these other effects. So technology and its direct effects. In terms of values, the thing that comes downstream from technology is more individualism, more focus on the self and less on others. That's a trend that's been going on for a while, but it has accelerated in terms of its change since the late 1960s. It means more equality and more freedom, but it can also mean more disconnection and incivility.
So, what is your explanation or partial explanation for why it is that baby boomers and Gen Xers, again, the greatest generation, are much more inclined towards risk taking and risky behavior than the generations that followed?
So this is something where it's mostly that Gen Z stands out from the previous generations. And we know this from survey data that teens in the last few years have been much less likely to say they like to take risks, so that they get a thrill out of taking risks. It shows up in behaviors too. They're less likely to get into car accidents or fistfights. And it is part of a bigger cultural trend of what's called a slow life strategy, that people take longer at every stage of the life cycle because we live longer. And for children and teens, what that often translates into is less independence. At that age, they're less likely to get a driver's license, have a paid job, drink alcohol. They don't go out of the house, and hang out with their friends as much as they used to. So this is, these trends are kind of a combination of the slow life strategy and the direct effects of technology, things like social media and texting, where they can talk to their friends and communicate with them when they're not in the same place. And that tends to coincide with overprotection or protection, depending on your point of view, right? So we've huge emphasis on child safety. Parents have fewer children and protect them more carefully. So this has had a lot of big upsides. Obviously, the fatality rate for children, say in car accidents, has gone way down with the advent of car seats, as one example. But there has also been what some people call mission creep, that it's become not only that parents are supposed to protect their children from physical danger, but they often end up protecting them from experiences. So that they're not, hanging out with their friends and driving a car, that they're sometimes it even extends to the idea that I don't want to be uncomfortable in a social situation. And I don't even want to have a conversation with someone who I might disagree with politically. So some of this stuff around cancel culture and trigger warnings that have, been controversial on campus the last 10 years or so may have this root in this safety culture.
So, I mean, this is complementary, spelt with an E, of Jonathan Haidt's stuff and the coddling of the American mind, right? It's like this. I see it in my daughter's own upbringing. We have one kid, very protective. Get near her and I'll kill you. And and we sent her to elite schools in DC, in part because we only had one, so we could afford it. And her entire life, like the worst thing you could do at school was to say something that hurt somebody else's feelings. And at every stage, there was a third party intercessor who would come in and mediate interpersonal disagreement in a way that just left. I'm not picking on my kid. I see it with all these kids to one extent or another, and including kids I now get as interns at various places, where it's the ability to just navigate interpersonal communication is much more difficult than it was in my in my day, or certainly in my parents' day. I mean, the fear of actually calling people on the phone without texting them first to let them know that you're going to call is really kind of amazing.
Yeah. And, so a lot of this traces back to the advent of the smartphone and the way social media became much more mandatory, especially for high school students in the early 2010s. So teens getting together with each other face to face has been on kind of a slow decline for a couple of decades, and then it just accelerates in the age of the smartphone and ubiquitous social media. And what that means is at this crucial time for developing social skills during adolescence, teens aren't doing that as much. And it takes thousands of hours to develop social skills to be comfortable, talking to other people. And then you layer on top of it our current atmosphere of political polarization and the vitriol around that, and some of these ideas like John and Greg talked about in their book of the anti-cognitive behavioral therapy thing of like it's us versus them, and if someone says something that you don't like, you should be very offended, and all of that kind of brought some of this to the forefront.
All of this said about the role of technology notwithstanding, it seems to me that the causal arrows can go both ways, right? Ideas can have consequences that are more acute because of technology, but the ideas themselves are a problem. And sometimes the technologies generate openings for ideas that otherwise wouldn't be available, right? So like lots of like I always said, the political, the sort of, this generation was the generation a lot of academics in sort of left-wing politically correct crowd were waiting for, where, because I went to school 30 years ago and the personal is political, perception is reality. These are old ideas. I mean, they were old when I was being indoctrinated with them, but you raise a generation that is told that if someone's making you feel uncomfortable, that's aggression. Those ideas all of a sudden have much more power to them. They intuitively make a lot more sense. And so I'm just kind of wondering, like, what are some ideas? I don't care if it's left, right, if it's non-political, but like, what are some of the ideas that you think are informing these generational differences that we're seeing today?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of things. So individualism is certainly playing a role. That it's pretty much taken for granted that we give kids advice like just be yourself, which, think about it. What if you're a jerk? What if you're a serial killer? Maybe you should be somebody else. Or you shouldn't care what other people think of you. What would the world actually be like if no one really cared what anybody else thought about it? It'd be pretty awful. So these are just highly individualistic pieces of advice that are kind of taken for granted in American culture and have been for a couple of decades now. But if you'd said those things to somebody in 1955, they would have looked at you like you were nuts. So I think that's definitely one underlying element is some of that self-focus and individualism.
And so one of the things I got from the Strauss and Howe book a gazillion years ago was how distorting the greatest generation was to the functioning of government, right? And they track how sort of at every stage where the World War II generation wanted something, government bent to its will, starting with the GI Bill, but then also like Social Security adjustments under Reagan. And you can go, there were like 4 or 5 things where the rules were changed to adjust to this giant, politically valuable, important group. I'm wondering, is that a story that you think continues where the government is like what have been governmental responses to generational changes? And have they all been, have they been both not positive and negative? Is it a loser's game for for policymakers to be chasing the feelings of specific generations?
Well, it's like everything else. I think there's trade-offs involved. So if you think about the way The culture and government and laws have changed since the silent and boomer generations. You can think of some really, really, what most people would agree are really positive changes. So the civil rights movement, for example, getting rid of segregation, or some of the court cases Ruth Bader Ginsburg was involved in before she was a Supreme Court justice to make things more fair in terms of gender. Getting rid of the laws, that said women couldn't have certain jobs. One thing I write about in the book is that the New York Times, as late as I think it was 1968, advertised jobs as male and female. And it wasn't until a city ordinance passed that they stopped doing that. Because they were asked to stop doing that by the National Organization for Women, and they refused. And they only did it once a law passed. So that's one way. And that's not just boomers. I mean, those things are associated with boomers, was really mostly silence who were behind a lot of those changes. So that's an example where you can see a smaller generation, the silence, and then the bigger generation that followed them, the boomers, having what most people consider a positive effect on government and how things changed. I think things that are more recent are kind of by definition going to be more controversial. And the millennials are a pretty big generation, and they're just coming into their political power. So that's going to be very interesting to watch, to see what changes they create and how that plays out with, say, Gen Xers and boomers. And, there is definitely a potential for some generational conflict or even warfare there.
So my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Yuval Levin, he's got this very well fleshed out argument about the decline in institutions. And he defines institutions essentially as organizations that shape character, right? That you have to surrender something of yourself for the greater good of this institution. And, the first question he says that any leader of an institution or any member of an institution should ask is, what is my role here? Right. And so, as a cartoonish example, the hippie who goes into the Marines and comes out a Marine, right? Because he bends himself to the institution. Universities were supposed to shape character, mold character. And now this whole thing that you're referring to about go with your gut, be true to yourself, runs completely contrary to all of that. And I think that's mostly a cultural ideological function, but part of my addendum to it has always been sort of what would be, I think, your argument, which is that institutions are tools. They're created to do something. And an enormous number of institutions in our life have been replaced by the supercomputer in our pocket, right? And the ability to call, to have something delivered, and the ability to shop out all sorts of tasks to other people. Like the necessity of communal endeavor has been shrinking and shrinking for a very long time. And that gets you to the problem of trust, because trust comes from dealing with other people. So can you just talk about the role of trust? And I want to sort of follow up on it a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I think we have to recognize that, some of these are very, very good changes. So, for example, the washing machine. I got totally obsessed with the washing machine in writing this book, thinking about the way people used to have to do laundry. And you can see that as character building, and you can see it as an institution. And there was probably some benefits to the way laundry used to be done, which is usually a big group of women boil water over an open fire and then use lye soap, which was, and would take all day, right? So you were spending time with other people, but it was grueling, horrible work. And now, as an individual, you can just throw your clothes in the washing machine and walk away and go read a book or scroll through social media. I mean, that's, it's incredible how much different that is. But small downside, yes, you're not doing something collectively with a group of people. And you can certainly make that argument too with delivery services, that it takes away the interaction that you might have with the grocery store clerk or the waiter at the restaurant. But there's so much convenience in that. Now, whether that's behind the decline in trust and institutions, whether it's those technology changes or overall individualism or other factors, it's probably several. I would probably lay more of the blame at the foot of the idea that we put the self first and
Mhm.
leave behind social rules. I think that does a pretty good job of explaining the decline in trust in institutions such as religion and government, and in some cases, education, and the press. That's a whole other discussion.
Mhm.
Um, and but we also have that decline in trust in other people, and all of this, is documented in surveys. I'm not just making this up or saying observations. That's the core of the book is these surveys of 39 million people taken over decades, and nationally representative and reliable. And that's how the data's gone. People are less likely to say that they trust others or that they think other people are going to be fair. And why that's the case is a really interesting question. I mean, technology probably has something to do with it if we interact with people less. But I think so much of it is also this idea of nobody follows social rules anymore, so you don't know what to expect from others. There's that possibility of uncivil behavior if everybody's out for themselves, because that can be kind of the toxic way that individualism has an impact if it is that idea of everyone for themselves.
So there was a piece on NPR this morning or the day before, time is a flat circle, about some study that found that trust in institutions has a huge correlation with COVID deaths. And I'm not sure. Again, I haven't seen the study, but I think directionally it kind of made some sense. And apparently, the state with the highest level of trust in institutions and trust in government generally is New Hampshire, of all places, the live free or die state. And this researcher was saying that if the rest of the country simply had those levels of trust, we could have seen a reduction of something along the lines of 500,000 COVID deaths. Now, again, who knows if that's entirely, I'm not trying to besmirch the guy or lionize him, but I think directionally there's something there. And it reminds me of something that's in your book about what is the silent generation kind of handled COVID better than everybody else, right?
Yeah, well, mentally at least, which is
Right,
surprising.
right.
I mean, because these are our senior citizens who bore the brunt of this epidemic. They were the most likely to be hospitalized and most likely to be killed by COVID. Yet, when asked about how worried they were, or depressed they were actually less anxious and less depressed than younger generations. And I think a good amount of that is they have seen a lot. They probably have the idea of this too shall pass. They have better mental health when they were younger, in these surveys, than the greatest generation before them and the boomers after them, which also helps rule out the explanation that's just they're less willing to admit to feeling these things. If that were the case, you'd think that the greatest generation would have been even more so in that department. But that isn't how it looks. It's a curve. The silent generation is kind of uniquely stable. Some of that is probably because many of them placed a big emphasis on family, and they were lucky in some ways. They didn't. Most of them didn't fight in World War II or in Vietnam. So some fought in Korea. That was a smaller war. So they managed, just by virtue of when they were born, to sidestep some of those awful experiences that the generations had on either side of them.
So like what do you do? Right. I mean, like, let's say that you're, and again, I have to say, I'm very persuaded by a lot of your arguments. Let's say you're right, but technology drives this atomization, this anomie, ivory tower people might call it. And what, like, you're not taking away everybody's phones, right? We might be able to take away kids' phones, which I'm kind of in favor of, depending on the exact proposal. But how do you reverse the trend? Because the trend seems towards technological innovation is only accelerating. It's not exactly, there's not a lot of great history unless you want to go back to the Luddites, who failed, or maybe the Japanese who kept guns out for 2 centuries. How do you reverse these trends? Or how do you ameliorate these trends?
These types of things that we've been talking about are going to be hard to change. So you did mention kids and teens, and I think that is where we have some potential for change. And we haven't talked about this yet, but the other piece of these technological changes it's important to mention is that the rise of smartphones and social media coincided with an enormous rise in depression among teens. It started around 2012. In other words, 8 years before COVID was on the scene. So the adolescent mental health crisis we have right now is not due to COVID. At least it didn't originate with COVID. Um, Teen depression doubled between 2011 and 2019, even before the pandemic. And it did continue to increase after that. Clearly, it's coinciding very precisely with this time when teens started spending a lot more time online and a lot less time with each other face to face. And they also started spending less time sleeping, possibly because of those technologies interfering with that. So, not a good formula for mental health, clearly. And when you look at that, the solutions are much more straightforward. There's a very long history of age gating things like alcohol and driving a car that we could put into place here. So, for example, we could say raise the minimum age for having a social media account to 16. And we'd have to actually verify age, but that can be done. We have the technologies available to do that. And that would make a big difference, I think, because the links to depression with social media use are the largest for children and for younger teens. So that would mean maybe at least there would be much more of a core experience of childhood and early adolescence spent interacting with friends face to face and not as influenced by all of the pressures of social media and, that kind of fire hose of often bad ideas that can exist there.
Tell me about porn. I mean, let me rephrase. One of these things that we've been sort of talking around is how young people disengage. A lot of our problems with young people today are most of modern history. Civilization is basically about regulating the misbehavior of young people, particularly young men. And when I talk to my daughter about the ubiquity of porn in college dorms, it's incredibly depressing to me. And there's a feeling I have that like the ubiquity of the porn has something to do with what some of me and my friends would call the Japanification of the United States, where you have these really remarkable rises in celibacy and disinterest in dating that predated our own in Japan 10, 15, 20 years ago. And the ubiquity of really off the charts porn in Japan, I always thought had a lot to do with it. What does the literature actually say? Because I wrote something about this recently, and a lot of people were like, well, what do you actually think is the problem with young people watching porn? And to be honest, I don't think that there's like, if it's something that you sneak into a movie theater every year and you think you're getting away with something, I can live with it. It's the daily exposure that I think is the problem. But what does the literature actually say about it?
So, let's put it in context of some of the generational changes. So you wouldn't expect that in the age of ubiquitous porn and online dating and Tinder and all of this, you'd think young adults would be having more sex than ever, but they're not. Just like, as you said, what happened in Japan 10 or 15 years ago has now come to our shores, that people in their early 20s, for example, much less likely to have had sex in the last year now compared to, say, millennials or Gen Xers before them, which is kind of mind-blowing considering how much more acceptable premarital sex is now. In theory, it also should be more available, but it's not. And so that has engendered a lot of theories about why that might be the case. So some really interesting research in sociology around this, and it does talk about porn as one possible example, that pornography promotes hot sex and cold emotions. But that's not a very real or human experience. And particularly for women, that's really not what they want to get out of sexual encounter. So a lot of them just opt out and say, well, this is the way it's going to be. I don't want to have anything to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other piece that's related to that is, especially on college campuses, the norm has become hookups instead of relationships. So having a sexual relationship, but you're not necessarily dating that person or boyfriend, girlfriend, in that kind of way. And that again means that some people are going to say, this is not what I want to be doing,
Mm-hmm.
and opt out. There's also probably, there might be somewhat of a direct role for pornography as well. If the idea is, well, I can just watch this and masturbate instead of having to take the risk to go out and meet another human being and figure out if they want to have sex with me or not, which is admittedly very nerve-wracking. However, it used to be that was what people did because that was, considered more fulfilling, and there wasn't, and pornography was not as available. The tough part in this research and these explanations is people who watch pornography, if you look at the individual level, are more likely to have sex, not less likely. So this is more of a group level kind of generational argument that as this became more prominent, then more people started becoming less sexually active. But it's harder to make that argument at the individual level.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me also, I mean, you kind of made reference to it, but just to be more explicit, like if you think that that's what sex is actually like, the expectations, the performance anxiety for both men and women is going to be acute.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're like, the idea that you're going to not live up to what is supposed to be some crazy, really grotesque ideal, could just put so much pressure on kids. It's like, I don't want to do that, particularly when you don't have the muscle memory about talking about your feelings and adjudicating differences and expectations. But right, we've checked the box on porn. So since you brought it up, your point about individual differences versus societal or generalizable, right? This was always my core problem with a lot of the generational stereotyping stuff, which was that, the example I've used on here a million times is The Greatest Generation. Now, if you stormed the beaches of Normandy, I'll gladly buy you a beer. You shouldn't have to pay for a lunch ever again. Kudos. If you were home in a drunk tank, right, in Peoria, there's no transitive property that you've accomplished nothing by being born in the same cohort of people who did something impressive. Similarly, I grew up Upper West Side of Manhattan, surrounded by boomer liberals who talked about the 1960s as if they were just out of the frame next to Martin Luther King on the podium, right? And sort of like how the number of people who said they were in the resistance in France skyrocketed after the war, or the number of baby boomers who said they were at Woodstock was 12 times the total attendance of Woodstock, right? And this sort of transitive property thing, which translated into this sort of identity politics thing for young people when I came to Washington, I found really, really frustrating. So on that point, can you talk a little bit about where this stuff goes wrong in terms of
Sure.
the heterogeneity of generations rather than the homogeneity of them?
Yeah. So there's a couple of interesting ideas here. So one is that what you're describing is also based on the events theories of generations. That what made what made boomers is Woodstock. When I would argue what made boomers is television and individualism.
Right. I Love Lucy and Gilligan's Island or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, or just the experience of growing up with television, and of, promoting more individualistic ideas, and getting married a little bit later and having kids a little bit later than the silent generation. Those things that, had I think a bigger impact. And same thing with Gen Xers and millennials. That, like, with millennials, the idea is, everything is because of 9/11. No, survey data, 9/11 barely budges anything. It's much more these other influences, and that helps too, because technology and these other influences are much more broad and much more generalizable than going to Woodstock or storming the beaches of Normandy, which were more unique experiences, a much smaller percentage of the generation. But much larger percentage of boomers, were exposed to those ideas around individualism or or TV, and then for millennials, same thing. So that's one piece. But the general idea is, okay, that we're grouping people into generations and we're looking at averages, and there's going to be exceptions. And that's absolutely true. But it's important to point out that's true of any time we group people. It's true when we look at age. It's true when we look at race and ethnicity, or gender, or region of the country, or cultures around the world. We look at average differences. It's how research works. It's how the human brain works to think about, how are these groups differing from each other. But there's always going to be overlap. I started my career in psychology by looking at gender roles and gender differences. And, over the years, really kind of my thinking evolved on this, that at first I was in the camp of, well, there's so much overlap, it doesn't really matter. But no, there's still an average difference in some things. And in certain things, like, say, aggression, the average difference is there, but not enormous. But what happens when you have that average difference is at the extremes. So for aggression, that's going to be violence. You're going to get 5 times as many men as women in that group. So, it basically, you have to hold these, the ideas in your head at the same time. There are average differences, but of course there are exceptions.
Yeah. The right and left tail of the bell curves are always going to be
Yes.
interesting places, right?
And that's the other thing with generations that becomes really fascinating.
Well, but it would seem to me that since you're studying this stuff at that level, there would be intra-generational differences that would help illuminate these generalizations, right? So, like, do we see these problems in communities where people homeschool more, or where, are there control groups within various today? What are the young, what are the kids today called? Gen Z.
Gen Z, yeah, is elementary school students are they're the generation after, which some people call alphas, and that I call polars.
Okay, so first of all, what are some good examples of? So let me put it this way: you make a generalization, you have a hypothesis about millennials, and you say it seems like X is happening with these millennials. Are there examples of things that are happening within that age cohort that are exceptions to that rule based upon certain, like differentials in the rollout of technology? Like, urban kids aren't going to have cars the way suburban or rural kids are going to have cars. Is there, I assume Amish people do not have a lot of the problems that come from cell phones.
They don't. There's some really, really interesting research on depression and mental health, among the Amish. And, they have tough lives in many ways, but depression barely occurs.
Yeah, it's like depression and asthma, they are spared, because if you grow up working with lots of animal dander and hay, your body has good, robust, well-calibrated immune systems. But, so, like, are there examples from, say, the silent generation or the boomers where, because I guess the point is I'm trying to get at is that there's an enormous amount of cultural heterogeneity within a generation, right? Southern people have different attitudes than Northern people, and Republicans different than Democrats, and we go down a long list. And so, are there things that you look for that sort of acid tests the generalizations, because you can find outlier populations?
So, there's a couple issues here. So one is the main effect. And of course, there are many ways that people differ. So generation's just one of them. And then, other demographic factors like gender and race and region of the country and cultural group and all of those things are in there as well. And so that's going to create plenty of variation within the generation. Just as if you group people by those other factors, there's going to be plenty of variation based on other factors. So there's always, a long list of things where you can see average differences based on demographics and other factors. But then the other question is, the generational changes over time, have they applied to all groups? And with a few exceptions, the answer is yes. Fortunately, these data sets that I work with, they allow you to break down things, by those other demographic factors. And what I've mostly found is that those generational shifts are remarkably similar over different groups. So socioeconomic status is another example. And you think some of those trends around teens growing up more slowly might be different based on SES, and they're not, which I was kind of surprised by, that the curves go down at roughly the same rate. And there's a couple of exceptions. So one is that the increase in depression and suicide and self-harm has generally been larger for teen girls and teen boys. Not for, I mean, in some cases it's about, the increase is about the same. There's also a main effect there that girls and young women are much more likely to be depressed than boys and young men. Then there was one other exception that I talked about for years that then changed. So one was that if you look at the decline in religious commitment, it was much more pronounced among white teens than among black teens. But in the last 5 to 7 years, it's started to look very similar because it's declined among black teens as well. So now there's not as much of a race difference in that trend.
And like when you see that, what is the explanation? Is it just that they were lagging behind the same cultural trends, or is there something that, was there a nudge that explains that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I'm not sure. With some of these trends, you can kind of think about the cultural influences of the time and pinpoint it. And with that one, it's still a little bit of a mystery to me.
Okay, so I have a slightly weird question as opposed to all these normal questions I've asked you. In my world, I have no idea how much or how little you know about me, but I'm one of the I was one of a small group of pretty committed conservatives who just refused to go along with any of the Trump stuff. And one of the most remarkable things to me in Washington has been that the people who, I hate the phrase red pilled, right? But they're the people who had the most dramatic sort of Saul on the road to Damascus conversion, changing almost everything that they once believed, and not just changing what they believe, but their actual temperaments, were Gen Xers. Like among my small cohort of people who are, feel like we're in an Invasion of the Body Snatchers movie, the red pilling of Gen Xers is one of the most remarkable things. And one of the reasons why I find it remarkable is that my generation is supposed to be super cynical. We're the last ones who grew up with a common culture, but we were young enough to sort of make the switch to the internet. We were not raised in safetyism. I certainly wasn't in New York City in the 1970s. And so I would have assumed that we would be more immune to it. And I don't know about the aggregate numbers, but in terms of the people who are the most intense, who lost their minds the most surprisingly, Giuliani and that crowd notwithstanding, we're a different generation, it was the Gen Xers. And I would feel remiss if I didn't just ask you if you have a theory about that.
I mean, it doesn't completely fit because it's more about just general party affiliation, but there is some research to suggest that people's political views tend to get, or a generation's political views tend to get set during adolescence and young adulthood. And they maybe at least partially depend on the party and the popularity of who's president at the time. So for Gen X, it's going to be Ronald Reagan, a Republican who was very popular. And it is true in the survey data that Gen X does tilt more Republican at the same age than any other generation. Because you have to always look at age because older people are more likely to be conservative and Republican. But Gen X stands out as being more Republican. Exactly how that connects to the specifics of Trump is more of a mystery.
Yeah, so that's my thing. Is I know that stuff about my generation. What has two thumbs and likes Ronald Reagan? This guy. But one of the things that makes me like Ronald Reagan is one of the things that make me not like Donald Trump. And the people who were Reaganite now, a lot of them have sort of turned their back on those sort of aspects, and they think being obnoxious is good, right? Trying to persuade people is a bad idea. And the people who most intensely have converted to that sort of pugnaciousness are Gen Xers, with the exception of people of Giuliani's age who I think there's a different, more understandable psychological process going on about this is their last shot at the rodeo and they want to stay relevant. And that's a sort of a different thing. I know that there's a consensus about this. There's a sort of an academic consensus or rule of thumb that politics in general is formed when you're young and then you sort of stay that way. But there are also these other theories about how people become more liberal over time and all that. And it seems to me that if what you're saying is right, which I think it is, that these cultural changes that are derived from technology are not necessarily ideologically or intellectually driven. They don't necessarily require you to be pro big government or anti big government or pro Republican or pro Democrat. And so I'm just wondering, like, is it possible that political affiliation and generational stereotypes don't necessarily goes together as a lot of people want them to be?
I mean, with that exception of Gen X standing out in terms of being a little more conservative and Republican, you can't really do that. I mean, the boomers are a great example because early on they got a very strong reputation for being very liberal.
Mm-hmm.
And these days that reputation is pretty much exactly the opposite, that they're more conservative. And some of that does seem to come from age. I mean, that's the usual thinking, is that as people get older, they become more conservative. But I think it's also that the goalposts move. If you think about the lifetime of boomers, it's a great example of that trajectory. That a lot of the things that they fought for as progressives when they were young happened. And then the next generations, let's just say millennials, and move on to the idea of, okay, well, that's fine, but we need more change. We need to do these other things. And boomers are like, wait a second, things have changed enough. And I think that's sometimes the viewpoint of older generations, and potentially now also including Gen X, where the idea is, I think, and people have written about this for Gen Xers in particular, who were progressive or moderate, and then feel like their beliefs stayed the same, and their party or their group moved really far to the left, took a really, really hard left turn. And they're like, wait a second, what is going on here? I thought these were my people, and I think they're crazy.
All right. So why do you call them polars?
Melting polar ice caps and political polarization, two things that are very impactful, and will probably become even more impactful as this generation grows older.
Okay. So it's a literary, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's a literary thing. So I got to ask, and I want to do it as value neutral as possible. The explosion in young people self-describing as somewhere on the non-binary gender spectrum and all that kind of stuff has, it's skyrocketed. It's amazing to me that when this country was fighting over gay marriage, one of the core arguments that my old friend Andrew Sullivan and others made was that, look, this is not a choice. People are born gay, they are gay. Therefore, society needs to create institutions that take that into account. And now the argument has moved to something. I'm not saying it's always a choice, but there's more agency involved in how you define your sexual identity today than there used to be.
We also have to separate sexual orientation from gender identity.
Right. So what do you think accounts for the explosion in new forms of new forms of a self-identification along sex and gender lines?
So for sexual orientation, you look in the big surveys, the percentage of people identifying as gay or lesbian has gone up, but not by a huge amount. So there, you can probably make an explanation around just more people being out, or willing to say that even on an anonymous survey, it being more accepted, and so on. The biggest increase by far is people identifying as bisexual, particularly among women. And so there, that you can make maybe more of a cultural argument. There's a lot of research saying that women's sexuality is more changeable responds more to, cultural norms and practices. And so that's perhaps, going to be less influenced by this idea of, I was born this way. That's going to, this is the general thinking overall, is that it's just going to be a little bit more flexible. And I think that's why that's the biggest change, for bisexual women, is that it's just more influenced by context.
And again, without imposing sort of the value judgment thing on it one way or the other, there does seem to be an element of sort of social contagion to it, right? I mean, like there's, among my daughter grand cohort, there are an enormous number of people who will say, not the longest number of young women who will say they are bisexual, but will have had no bisexual experiences. But there seems to be some sort of safe harbor in saying that. And part of it, I think, is the sort of innate cultural premium and subsidy we put on being rebellious and nonconformist. And so if you just say, yeah, I'm traditionally a heterosexual person, that sounds boring. And then the cases can get much more complicated and all that. But I'm just wondering, since you argue that a lot of these generational changes and distinctions are driven by technology, what is the relationship between technology and these changes? Is it just the transmission belt of social media normalizes these kinds of ideas much more quickly and transmits them much more quickly?
I mean, we need a lot more research on that, but certainly it's much more possible for young people to get information online. But it does have to go hand in hand with values, because if it wasn't something that was acceptable, that wouldn't be happening. So I think there's a lot of different causes here.
All right. So other than the age restriction stuff, which I'm generally with you on, I have my libertarian friends who insist that it's just too draconian an imposition to ask for age verification, and I'm unpersuaded.
I mean, would they say that for selling alcohol? Would they say that for getting a driver's license? Should we have 10-year-olds driving?
I think all of their arguments are fine as explanations about why we need to do a better job at doing age verification, right? So like people who are above 18 don't want to give their driver's license to Pornhub, right? They don't want to give their date of birth because that's good for scammers and all. Those all seem like perfectly legitimate complaints.
There's third-party services that can do that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, to me, it's like the kind of thing like you raise during beta testing to make age verification better, not to not have age verification. But so beyond the age verification stuff, like what are concrete things that you think either parents or government can do that have a chance of having real buy-in from a large number of people to fix some of these problems that we're seeing with younger people? And I want to stipulate, not everything that we see with young people is bad, and not everything that we see in old people is good. I agree with that entirely. Everything is double-edged swords all the way down. But it would be good to have young people be able to talk to each other better. It would be good to have higher levels of social trust. I'm willing to defend these propositions.
It would be good if we didn't have such high levels of teen depression.
Yes, right. So like what are there other things that you think have a shot of not being thrown into the red versus blue bullshit dynamic and let people actually solve some problems?
I mean, at the individual level, I think there's two things. So one is no devices, no phones in the bedroom overnight, especially for young people, but listen, for adults too. That's really the way to go. There's so much research on that, sleep labs, correlational. I mean, you name it, that people don't sleep as well, even if that phone is off. It's disruptive to getting good rest. So that it just has to be put outside of the bedroom, outside of very unusual circumstances. And those circumstances are almost always going to be adults in terms of work, or elderly parents or something are almost never going to apply to kids and teens. So that's the first piece. Oh, and I always have to mention with that, people say, oh, but I can't do that because my phone's my alarm clock. Buy an alarm clock.
Yeah.
Like $15 on Amazon. You can buy it on Amazon on your phone. Put your phone away. Get a good night's sleep. So that's the first thing. And then for parents, I mean, look, I have 3 kids myself. They're 16, 13, and 11. And oh my God, we are just in such a difficult position as parents right now because all of these things are so unregulated. And because this, some of these technologies have some upsides too. What do we do? Right? It's very, very hard. So many parents are struggling with this. So, and I've heard a lot of people make the argument, oh, cat's out of the bag, you can't do anything. I think that's a really, really defeatist argument. Of course you can. Just because bad stuff is out there doesn't mean you should throw up your hands and give up. So just try to have some limits. So one, that the no phones in the bedroom overnight is a great example. Another is to put off giving your kid a full-blown smartphone as long as possible. So you can give them a flip phone. You can give them a pared down phone like a Gab phone. You can just talk and text and take pictures, and that's it. My 13-year-old and 11-year-old both have that. My 11-year-old wouldn't have one at all, but she takes a bus where the stop is a mile away, so we didn't have a ton of choice. If you give your kid a smartphone, put parental controls on it. So my 16-year-old had a flip phone until about 6 months ago. She said it became part of her identity. She was the kid with the flip phone. When she did get her driver's license, and then it made sense to get her the smartphone. But still, she can't download apps on it. So if she wants social media, it has to be an agreement with her parents that this is okay. Because this is the other problem with social media. You don't need parental permission to open an account. So there's 9 and 10-year-olds on TikTok, for example. And their parents may have no idea.
And at the policy level, I mean, is it all about phones? I mean, can we make kids drive stick shift again? Because that way they have their phone hand busy on the gears.
One other policy thing that can be done is no phones during the school day, bell to bell. Talk to any high school or middle school teacher, and they'll tell you about how distracting it is. The kids have their phones with them, and they're on them in class all the time. And so it's really having a negative impact on learning. And then the other thing is, so some schools take a halfway approach, like, okay, everybody's got to put their phone, in a little like shoe pocket in the classroom. But that doesn't solve the issue of kids at lunch being on their phones instead of talking to each other. So that's why the bell to bell thing is the best idea, because there is this critical window for developing social skills. And if they can talk to each other at lunch, that's one more opportunity for them to be able to practice those skills.
All right. So one thing we haven't really talked about, and I know I got to let you go, but it feels to me that of the, when you say polars, it's melting ice caps and polarization, the pandemic really seems to have done a number on a remarkable number of people in ways that we're going to be living with for a long time. And it feels in some ways, we've got this a little bit with the silent generation, that everything that was all the bad trends were made much worse by the pandemic. Social isolation, distrust of leaders and institutions and all that kind of stuff. How do you think we're going to look back on the, and I'm not trying to scapegoat people because I think there's a lot of nonsense on both sides of all the COVID stuff, but how do you think we're going to look back on the real toll from COVID, especially for young kids in terms of learning loss and socialization and all that?
I think that's going to be the biggest issue, is the learning loss and how long that's going to take to work itself out. The mental health stuff is also bad, but the increase in teen depression was pretty much at the same rate, say from 2019 to 2021 that it had been earlier, maybe a little bit more. But the thing that's good there is, well, kids are back to almost anyway 2019 in terms of socializing when there's no more lockdowns or any of that kind of thing. However, that trend of interacting online rather than face to face is still there. So I think that had the much bigger impact on social skills and mental health than the pandemic per se. I worry the most about the kids who were like in kindergarten and first grade, the learning that they missed out on during that time, and the social interaction and language development that they missed out on. But kids are resilient. I think some of that will work itself out. I think the legacy that we're living with, at least right now, I don't know about 5 years from now, but I think the biggest legacy that we're living with right now is people don't know how to behave in public anymore. There are all the articles about, people in movie theaters for Barbie and Oppenheimer, the way people behave on airplanes sometimes now. I don't know. There's this underlying, and it's exactly what you're talking about. It's the distrust. It's the lack of trust in institutions. It's the everybody for themselves. This is extremely anecdotal. I would love to see somebody do a study on this. It seems to me a lot more people are running red lights.
Yes, for sure.
Yes. And just do it. And that seems to me like it's kind of part of the same pie as, the people are on their phones, during the movie, and people don't know how to act anymore. And I know that makes me sound like I'm 90 years old. But I think that is partially an outcome of the pandemic, is that people just kind of forgot how to act. Plus, that underlying trust that we're supposed to have in each other and in government and in institutions is just gone.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more about that. I wrote a column a while back about some of that, where I went and looked at, road rage incidents, air rage incidents, the incredible spike in rudeness in retail and how difficult it was to hold on to people. The shoplifting thing is complicated for a bunch of other reasons, but, and again, our politics and all that stuff, rudeness was a problem going before the pandemic, but it put it all on steroids. And I think that one of the things you get, first of all, I become sort of an evolutionary psychology guy when it comes to some of this stuff, insofar as we have well-developed evolutionary mechanisms to freak out about invisible things that can hurt us. and I think it put everybody on a weird sort of fight or flight kind of footing.
Yeah, good theory. I like it.
And then the other part of it is that once you see that social norms are actually social constructs and they're kind of invisible and that you can violate them, it becomes really difficult to sort of reestablish them as the way you think real life is, right? It becomes, so that was just sort of a custom. That wasn't like the rule. And that gets internalized with a lot of people. And just the rise in people being jerks was just astounding after the pandemic.
And, we can hope that might work itself out. If it was due to the pandemic, maybe it'll disappear in a few years. But if it's due to lack of confidence in institutions and distrust, it might be around for a while.
Yeah. Or it could be autocatalytic, right? And it's like there's a line in Orwell where he says, a man can take to drink because he thinks of himself a failure and become all the more of a failure because he drinks. Like Trump got in a lot of people's heads, made a lot of people crazy pro, crazy anti. And then you overlay that with the pandemic and Trump's erratic leadership on that issue. And so it's one fuels the other. And it's difficult, I think, for some people to tease out what was a political state of unease versus a biomedical public health state of unease. But it is what it is. All right. Professor Jean Twenge. Sorry. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Professor Twenge, I said it right, has left the building. I got to say, I think she's really impressive and persuasive, and I'm in violent agreement on a great many things. But it's funny, she has what we call internally here at the Remnant a Tyler Cowen problem, insofar as her answers are so concise and short and good. I mean, they're very good, but it kept catching me off guard about what to ask next. Usually I let guests talk because I think that's part of the, I know sometimes I have long preambles to my questions, but once I get them out, I let the guests have their say, and usually they really run with it, and it gives me time to think about the next question. And here she was so concise and on point that I often got caught off guard. So that's a reflection of my shortcomings, not hers. But I thought it was a little on the at times stressful side. But her new book actually is really interesting and full of interesting stuff. And I apologize to my libertoid friends who are all against the age verification stuff, but I'm on Team Twenge on this stuff. And I guess that's all I got. So again, her latest book is Generations: The Real Differences Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silence, and What They Mean for America's Future. And thanks for all the feedback on the solo Remnant, including my exciting announcement, which I'm just going to leave hanging out there in case you didn't listen to it. You can just go tune into the last 5 minutes of the solo Remnant if you want. And other than that, that's all I got. So I'll see you next time.